university research around the use of social media and press in relation to activism and how it impacts the narrative now and in the future. So today's subject will be covering the genocide that happened in Srebrenica, which many people will recognize possibly as the Bosnian genocide. And here I'm here with Kim Saqique, who's an associate professor and head of community and criminal justice at De Montfort University, and also the chair of Remembering Srebrenica, East Midlands Regional Board, I believe. Yes, welcome, Kim.
Thank you.
So from my understanding, the genocide happened in many of our lifetimes,
yes,
mine including. So I want to transport the listeners to 1995. But before I go there, I just need to let the listeners know some of this will be hard to listen to. It's not the easiest story to listen to, and I do need to point that out. So a little bit of a warning here, you know, some of this will be difficult. And if you do find it difficult, by all means, you know, reach out to some organizations if you need to in order to get support if necessary. So from my understanding, it happened in 1995, 26 years ago. At the time, I was 10 years old, so I'm giving away my age at the moment. I'd say at the time, my parents probably sheltered me from it a little bit, being 10. My experience of it, my very little experience of it at the time, was the fact that there was a Bosnian family who were Muslim that came to the school, and we had the children join us in the class, and we weren't sure why they came. They couldn't speak English at the time, so we were finding ways to communicate with them. So that was my experience of it, and understanding something had happened, which is why they had come to the UK. So that's a lot. I've done a lot of talking here, so I'm going to hand it over to you. So a little bit about, it'd be really good for the listeners to understand what happened. So fill us in.
Okay, so I suppose for me it's really important that listeners understand that it wasn't just this kind of one-off event in 1995, that actually it was part of something much bigger and that had gone on much longer. And obviously you said Bosnian genocide, and absolutely yes, what happened right across the country were serious crimes against humanity, orchestrated murder, torture, sexual violence against women as well. But if we kind of go back to see where it started, really, so Bosnia-Herzegovina was originally part of what we now call the former Yugoslavic Republic, which was a federation. It was made up of like 6 component republics, including places like Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, and obviously Bosnia. And during that time, so just after World War II, under the leadership of a guy called Tito, really, you know, Muslims, Catholics and Orthodox Christians all lived together pretty cohesively. And it was that way for quite a while. Tito died in 1980, and at that point, I think his ability as a leader had been to kind of keep that cohesiveness, which is so important to communities. And so you started to see the fragmentation of Yugoslavia pretty much along ethnocentric lines. So it was like a real rise in nationalistic view. So by 1991, Croatia and Slovenia then claimed independence, and Bosnia wasn't far behind. So April 1992, Bosnia was internationally recognised as being independent. And I think that really kind of, that breakup of Yugoslavia really prompted a war based on ethno-nationalism. After Bosnia's independence in April 1992, it was literally months, so really, really close to that Bosnian Serb forces, under leadership of Ratko Mladic, took control of the city of Sarajevo. So actually the capital of Bosnia is under siege for actually one of the longest sieges in history, so 1,425 days, like almost 4 years. And people there were under constant shelling and sniper fire. So up in the mountains particularly were hidden Bosnian Serb snipers. So even things like going to get a loaf of bread or milk, all those supplies were starting to dwindle, but taking your life in your own hands to make that dash for food and water.
That's so interesting you should say that, because recently, not too long ago, I travelled out to a refugee camp in Palestine, and we were told the same thing in terms of going out to get provisions, that there is a chance. So that's really interesting. And you saying that, I can actually feel that, because I was walking through the actual refugee camp, and I was told that there could be a sniper on my back. That's just actually given me goosebumps hearing that.
Yeah, that's quite often when we look at these things, they are very similarly structured. You know, from the Holocaust, actually, what happened in Bosnia used those kind of Nazi structures in terms of the language that was used to initiate the kind of hatred and discrimination and the breakup of society, but also the means to commit genocide. So it was early 1993 that Bosnian Serb forces actually attacked the Srpska area in eastern Bosnia.
Right.
So actually at that point, many Bosnian Muslims, called Bošnjaks, fled the Srpska region and headed to Srebrenica and Žepa enclaves. And these were areas that had been established by that point by the UN as safe areas.
Yes, so I've read that, and then you see reports that suddenly hold the UN into account because of what happened in Srebrenica afterwards.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things with the UN peacekeepers is that they cannot fire unless they're fired on.
Right, yes,
so
of course.
As peacekeepers, you know, I mean, obviously we could get quite political here, but it's very difficult to be somebody who is a peacekeeper who's not allowed to fire on anyone. So in those safe areas, I think that really became the target for Bosnian Serb forces, that they thought, you know, as part of this, what was initially deemed to be ethnic cleansing, so actually moving Muslims out of areas to create a greater Serbia, which is what they were really looking for, an ethnically Serb area of their own. So this became that kind of strategic focus point to commit genocide.
Right.
So Bosnian Muslims across the country in towns, and I think this is the important thing, you know, we talk about the Srebrenica genocide, and that's the only one that has been legally defined as a genocide. So I think that has been a particular issue about how we define what is a genocide and what isn't. But if we look at areas across the whole of Bosnia, places like Visegrad, Prijedor, Foča, Gorazde and Srebrenica were actually subjected to forcible deportations.
Right.
People put into what the Serbs would have called deportation camps, but were actually quite often death camps. And you know, murder, sexual violence towards women was commonplace. But obviously, as I said, what happened in Srebrenica itself was deemed to be a genocide after the event.
Yeah. So I've noticed that they've actually recently deemed it to be a genocide, and in The Hague as well, they have said that it is, and they're holding people to account. But I know that as well, that COVID has actually put a bit of a delay on some people being held account. Is there any little bit more that you can talk about? Has anyone been held to account for what happened?
The biggest one recently was Ratko Mladic. So he was originally convicted, and then recently in The Hague, he had obviously appealed against his conviction and his sentence, and so that went back through The Hague a few weeks ago now. But his conviction stands, and he has now been given his sentence. And
right.
Actually will serve it here in the UK.
Oh, okay.
So
that's interesting.
Nations that have signed up to be able to take committers of genocide and war crimes into their prisons, so we are one of those. So he will be serving his sentence in a prison here.
Right, okay, that's really interesting. So, from my understanding, some of the Bosnian population are still not happy with the way it's been recognised as a genocide. Because although it's been recognised as a genocide, there is these nuances of it not being, even in sort of political hemispheres. And that, I can imagine, brings a lot of trauma to those who are victims. I mean, reading a lot about it recently, I found that there's a lot of people still looking for their family, or finding, I'm not even going to say their full bodies, parts of their bodies, to then be able to say this person has now passed on and we can put closure on there. Yeah. So is that right? So although you're saying to me that it's been recognised as a genocide, there are still nuances. Can you explain a little bit more why?
Yeah, so we talk obviously, like I was saying, the Bosnian genocide. And I prefer that term because for me, what happened across the whole of the country fits the legal definition of a genocide. But as I said, the only one that has been legally defined was what happened in Srebrenica.
Right.
And that was the systematic, orchestrated executions
Mm-hmm.
of over 8,000 Bosnian men and boys, and deportation of tens of thousands of Bosniak women.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's really important to know about that is how quickly things turn. So as I was saying, people had fled to Srebrenica and Žepa as safe areas, and it was literally in the matter of days. So 2nd of July, attacks on those Srebrenica and Žepa, as those enclaves, began, and it continued pretty much till about the 11th of July, and then actually Ratko Mladic went in and said, on a Serb national day, on one of their holidays, he was giving Srebrenica to the Bosnian Serb people.
Right.
And so, you can imagine somewhere where you have lived in harmony
Mm-hmm.
with, Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Croats, for your entire life, suddenly, and this in particular as a genocide was quite rapid. They came in, the UN peacekeepers couldn't really do a lot. There were lots of political issues around which forms were used and
Mm-hmm.
whether they were submitted on time to the right people and all of those kinds of things. But this was mass execution. About 20,000 or so people had actually fled to Srebrenica and Žepa, and then moved on into Potocari, which is a small town just outside Srebrenica, and that's where, in an old battery factory, they'd made the UN base.
Right.
And so the UN Dutch bats, which is why the Netherlands has obviously been in the media recently about being called to account.
Mm-hmm.
They were the UN peacekeepers at the time in that area. So initially they opened the doors to the UN base and allowed people in. But by the time they got about 5,000 in, they claimed they were full, could not let anyone else in. So there were 20,000 people outside who weren't safe, who couldn't get in. The estimates are around 15,000 men and boys actually decided to flee through the woods on what's now termed the Death March.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a 63-mile walk, bearing in mind under sniper fire, shelling and things. It took 5 days plus to do this walk. And they were trying to get to Tuzla, which was actually in a free zone, so it wasn't under Bosnian Serb control. Many didn't make it. One of my very good friends, who is a genocide survivor, Hasan Hasanovic, he's curator and head of research at Srebrenica Memorial Centre in Potocari. He actually lost his twin and his father on that march. And as you were saying, lots of people still have family who were missing.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I used the term lost there, and it's something that's been mentioned this week. I was at a conference and a number of survivors and academics talking about what happened in Srebrenica said we shouldn't use the term lost. These people weren't lost.
No, of course.
They were purposefully killed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a really clear distinction to make.
So essentially they were murdered, weren't they? And then they're not missing or lost. Actually, they are buried, and people are having to find the remains, knowing that they are. So what made you get involved and be part of the organisation and help to raise awareness? Because you're clearly really passionate. I can see that you're touched. It's definitely touched me just reading it and researching it this week. And definitely try and get involved and put things out and educate the community and the global sort of as much wider community actually globally as much as possible. So I'd like to know what made you get involved. Where is that passion coming from?
Well, I'm a criminologist and head of obviously division of community and criminal justice, so I'm very bothered about crime anyway. Coming from a Christian background, married to a Muslim, I've experienced a lot of discrimination on a personal level. Why have I married a Musa? And those kinds of things. I've experienced that for, actually, weirdly enough, the last 26 years. I married the year of the Bosnian genocide,
right?
Which always makes it feel a little bit personal for me. But my key areas of interest were around religion and crime, particularly, and hate crime probably more specifically. And we took some students out initially to Auschwitz-Birkenau camp in Poland to learn about the Holocaust. And I came back thinking I didn't feel anything. I should have felt something, and then I felt quite guilty about that. That I'd been to this place where horrific things had happened, and I felt nothing. And so I started some work on a research project looking at how we educate young people about state crime and genocide, and what things we need to do to get them to stand up and do. And obviously, connections that I had actually with St Philip's Multi-Faith Centre here in Leicester. We train our police students there on diversity and community engagement. And Tom Wilson, who's the director, nominated me to go on a delegation to Bosnia with Remembering Srebrenica. So they contacted me and said they'd like to send me on a delegation, which I accepted, obviously. I didn't really know that much.
I was going to say, how much did you actually know before you went out?
They gave me a reading list and some kind of information pack so that I could do some pre-reading before I went. I think that was really useful. Similar to Anne Frank's diary, there was one called Zlata's diary, so about a young Bosnian girl growing up during the conflict. And so I went on this delegation and met survivors from a number of different organisations. So I met with the Association of Women Victims of War, an amazing woman called Bakira Hasacic, and who brought me to tears. She's done that 3 times now. In fact, because of her courage and her resilience to fight for justice for women who were systematically raped as part of a weapon of war. We also met with the mothers of Srebrenica and Jepa, who are just some of the loveliest women I think I have ever met. And obviously we took a tour of Sarajevo. I've been 3 times now for different reasons, and met, like I say, with a really quite a significant number of survivors. And I think hearing survivor testimony, I was talking at a conference the other day and I said, one of the things when we're talking about countering hatred and the denial narratives, because I think that, particularly for Srebrenica, has been a real political issue, that Serbia denies that there was a genocide, and their own political leadership does too. And so for me it was about that activism. How do we counter those narratives? How do we stop revisionism of history? How do we stop denial? And one of the key things there, I think, is survivor testimony.
Correct,
because it's personal.
Of course.
And there's a brilliant guy called Julian Harrison who wrote this book called Suspended Disbelief. And it's very much about understanding the Holocaust. And one of the things he talks about is, as the number of survivors starts to shrink, as we lose members of the survivor communities, actually their testimonies become more valued and more valuable. And I think that's so true because they really reach into your heart. It becomes a personal connection.
100%. I think a lot of the things that I've read online in relation to the genocide has been the testimonies that actually do move you to tears, and the language used. And you've got to remember that there were families that lost their breadwinners. They lost their rocks essentially in that moment, and their whole lives were torn apart. And some of them let them go thinking that they were being sent to a place that they were going to be safe. And therefore happily would have walked away thinking they're going to see each other again at some point, possibly. Not all, I recognize that, but some would have. And then to hear of the sheer way that they were murdered must be really difficult. It's difficult to read.
Yes, it is.
So then to go out there and speak to people on the ground, I know that's something that I've experienced when I've gone out to refugee camps in sort of the West Bank. And when you actually hear the accounts, especially of the elderly, those that have had to live it and they've had to try and come to terms with that emotional trauma for all their lives. I'm sure there are people that have passed who will never and never will get answers as to where their loved ones are, and had to just live without the closure. When you hear these testimonies, how do you sort of give them a voice to ensure that when you come back here, they have that opportunity to be heard because they're not here?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm in a really privileged position. I'm an educator, so actually I can share those testimonies with my students, with my neighbours, which I did at the weekend as part of a community get-together to learn about Srebrenica. But we've actually also been involved this year in, well, at the end of last year, but it was put out this year, a series of podcasts. And so there were interviews undertaken by Remembering Srebrenica as the charity with a podcast company called HAJ, which did an amazing job. So they interviewed survivors, and obviously in Bosnian, and then auditioned for people to take on the English voices. And I was really honoured to take on the voice of an amazing woman called HAJ, and to share her story. And it's a 6 podcast series. It's not easy listening. You know, it's not something you're going to put on in the car on the way home. It is something you really need to engage with. But it gives you the full background. You know, what I've been able to say today about the kind of history stuff is really, really brief. So to give them a voice, to let them talk about the impact, I think, is the thing. But also to recognise and share with them their courage and resilience in not wanting revenge. I think for me, the reason I wanted to get involved and to take action and to work, you know, to support the charity really was because these people want a re-established, multi-ethnic, multi-faith society. They just want to go back to the way they were. No, you know, justice, absolutely yes. Truth, absolutely yes. But peace.
In a lot of situations, when you speak to people who have survived or lived through these situations, they all say that we lived happily together and we were fine. And then someone came along who wanted power and then essentially broke that down and caused division. And this is said over and over and over again in history. And in some cases, they are still living through that, and many cases actually. And then there's many countries who are now living through the aftermath of that happening. How do you reassure someone who's sat there saying to you, "We were fine"? Like, what do you do when you go out there and speak to them? You know, is there any support that you're able to offer them when you're out, when you've been out, or?
Well, I think for the survivors, you know, there are a number of associations around the UK. So obviously, with Remembering Srebrenica, we also engage with, say, the Bosnia Association over in Derby, and also in like the West Mids as well over in Birmingham, and there are support networks there. I think obviously for many of them who came to this country, we gave them that safe place to be.
Of course.
And to be able to rebuild their lives. And I think that's one of the key things. So our theme this year for Remembering Srebrenica is actually about rebuilding lives. You know, and I think that's as applicable to all of us who have been through COVID. You know, businesses are rebuilding, people are rebuilding their lives, you know, having been, you know, self-isolating and those kinds of things. Dealing with, you know, quite significant trauma from that alone. And I think what survivors do is really show us about courage and resilience and about how you rebuild your life in a way that supports your community. That really shows that resilience and courage and togetherness. And I think that for me has been one of the most amazing things I've seen.
So the organisation, I mean, shortly we'll go for a break, but we'll come back and ask more about the organisation you are part of and what we can do, what I can do to get involved. And I'd love to hear more about the resources, and I've seen some amazing things online, so I'd love to know and let the listeners know more about what we've got to offer. But just to summarise your experience before we go to the break, in a sentence of your 3 experiences going out, if you can just summarise them before we go.
I would say transformative. It's a word I use in terms of my education. So I think the experience for me personally and professionally was transformative. I think it taught me that actually, however difficult things are, if you have faith, and if you come through that with that courage and resilience that the survivors had, then actually you're in a really good place.
Yeah, I know. I can 100% agree with you on that, and you start to appreciate a lot of what you have as well. But then there's that guilt as well sometimes when you come back from places and you think, why am I so lucky to have all this privilege in comparison to people who have suffered so much? But then you see them with their fight and their resilience, and they smile.
Yes.
They smile and they hug you and they give you so much welcome. And I think that's the most important thing, and that's what keeps us going.
Oh, absolutely.
That's just skimming. I'm assuming you had many of these. Hello, it's Jeeda. You're back to my show, In Retrospect, on HAJ RADIO 87.9 FM. We're here with Kim, who's a professor and from De Montfort University. but also is part of an organization called Remembering Srebrenica, which is about the Bosnian genocide and what happened out there in 1995 and earlier, to be fair. So I'm just going to start this segment by reading out something that I found online, and it'd be great if you can actually explain a little bit more about what I'm reading. It is a recollection on one of the videos that I found online. I mean, there's a few things actually. The timeline is a bit confused as well, so it'd be great for you to just explain a little bit why it comes across confused as well. But I'm just going to read this. So it says, so this is essentially a daughter talking about the loss of her father. Fact is that mean people after war ended tried to hide mass graves with digging known graves and relocating them to other places. And because of that, after 22 years, we still cannot find our families, and we find bones from the same person in different graves. She remembers her father as being a good and brave man, because after escaping the Serbian army, so essentially he got away, he went back because he couldn't leave people to help others. And as he went to cross the bridge again, at this moment, he was killed, and they've not been able to find his body since. And they think that he was probably thrown in the river. I mean, that was a really, I'm skim reading it. I don't want to go into the detail. It's very difficult to read. But I'm sure you had accounts of very similar. So I don't understand why are they finding bones in different graves? Can you explain a little bit more?
It was what I was talking about earlier in terms of the denial narrative, really. And if you want to be able to deny that a genocide's happened, the best way to do that is to hide the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as I was saying, what happened in Srebrenica, over 8,000 men and boys were killed. Many summarily executed, so literally taken out to school playing fields, open air places, and just shot.
All right.
And then buried in mass graves. But obviously, over the next that was kind of July 11th onwards, which is why Srebrenica Memorial Day is on the 11th.
Mm-hmm.
But over the next 4 months, what the Bosnian Serb army actually did was go back and dig up the mass graves.
Right.
And then, but with machinery, things like diggers and things, and take some of the bodies to other graves.
Right.
And also to mix in animal bones and things as well, so that actually it made it much more difficult to be able to identify. Obviously, early 90s, we weren't so crash hot with DNA like we are now.
Of course.
But actually, the International Commission for Missing Persons in Tuzla, in Bosnia, and the Tuzla Forensic Identification Project based there, have been doing amazing work in DNA profiling, taking blood samples from family members who've been left behind, and then creating a database. So as they discover body parts, which in general it often is, it's very rarely a full body,
Right.
They are able to DNA profile the bones and actually identify somebody's loved one. One of the mothers of Srebrenica talks about actually finding 2 bones, that's all, of her sons.
Right.
And actually they were found in mass graves 25 kilometres apart. So you can start to see
Wow. Yeah.
the lengths that people had to go to be able to identify and to repatriate these loved ones with their families.
So how many people have definitely been identified? Because I know not all have.
It's
as of today
7,000-ish, so there's still over 1,000 still not found,
right,
and or identified. At the Tuzla Identification Project, actually they have some bones that they haven't yet been able to repatriate. It's also difficult for families because some choose not to have the 1 or 2 bones back, but to actually try to see if more can be found because they would like to bury a complete body, or as complete as possible.
right.
Obviously Islamically, burial is very quick.
Of course, yes.
But these people are not waiting 24 hours for a burial. They're actually some even now have waited 26 years for repatriation of their family members' bodies.
I think the difficult thing is, from what you're saying, is, and this was what I found really difficult reading about the genocide, was if it had not happened, these people are most likely to have been living amongst us today.
Yeah.
Sat doing similar to what we're doing. It is so real, it's so recent history. It's not something that we talk about or read. Really, it's not history in history books. It's within our lifetimes and within the time frame. And I think that makes it so real in terms of, you know, us being able to almost put ourselves in that position. And like I said, you know, now it makes it very real when the young, at the time they were young boys, came into my classroom, and they couldn't speak English or anything at the time, but they were resilient, and now I understand where that resilience came from and what they came from. And actually, at a young age, you're very much sheltered from that, and maybe to a certain degree they were, because they were quite young and they probably did not realize. But I guess looking into their history, which is not their history, they probably still have family, and they can probably relate or put themselves into the shoes of other members of their family who are no longer here. And I'm sure there's many daughters, mothers who are out there, brothers, fathers who have lost their loved ones in trying to escape the situations that happened. I think the reality for a lot of us is, we keep saying, and this term gets coined so many times, we can't let history repeat itself. But yet we find ourselves in this situation over and over again. We find ourselves protesting over and over again. We find ourselves raising awareness and still trying to get things defined as what they are, which is what Remembering Srebrenica organization is. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the events that we can take part of? I'm sure there's a lot going on next week with it being the 26th anniversary. And I've noticed that the website's got amazing resource, so I'm sure for different organizations, so for education, for the police. So is there a little bit more that you can talk about how they can use your website to actually educate, even from young to old, or even in your organizations?
No, absolutely. So Remembering Srebrenica is a charity that has kind of three main focuses, really. The first is obviously remembering the victims and survivors across, obviously, Bosnia and Herzegovina. But most importantly, probably, is really to learn those lessons. You know, like you said, we shouldn't let history repeat itself. And after the Holocaust, we said never again. You know, after Rwanda, after Cambodia, we keep saying never again. And actually, it's almost a pointless phrase now, because never again doesn't really mean never again. And so learning those lessons from Srebrenica is so important, to look at how hatred can manifest itself, and how that can escalate so very quickly. So that's the second. And the third is really to pledge, and it's like you were saying about social activism, pledging to take action to build stronger, safer, more cohesive communities. And that for me is that social activist in me, is that bit for me is about moving people on to make change. I suppose in terms of events, this week is Srebrenica Memorial event culminating on Sunday. So we actually had an online national event yesterday, but you can actually catch that up on Facebook. So if you look up Remembering Srebrenica on Facebook, be able to follow it there. There's a memorial event in Derby, actually tomorrow, at the Derby of Bosnia Association at 12 noon, which is a memorial service and laying of white flowers. Actually, you'll see I'm wearing a white flower today. And that actually stands, the white petals, there are 11 of them, which is the 11th of July representation. Right. The white is for their innocence, and the green is for hope and for justice. And again, that's another core thing that Remembering Srebrenica believing, you know, supporting survivors, making sure their stories are heard, so that people can learn from that and do things. So I suppose in terms of events this week, there are probably not many of those left. A lot of them are online. If people want to know more, there are some places to go. As you said, the Remembering Srebrenica website is a great place to go. It has resources. It also has a regional map, so you can actually click on your region and find events. So if people are interested, they can go and click on the events. On Sunday at Leicester Cathedral, a prayer will be said as part of the service as well. So it's not just about, Muslim communities and Muslim organisations being involved. This is everybody, from all faiths and none, actively being involved. You can pledge to take action and become a community champion. So if people are interested in that, obviously if they follow at East Srebrenica on Twitter, they can get in contact with me. And you'll see that we're using these pledge cards. So people are sharing pledges about, I will stand up to hatred and discrimination. I will always be on the side of the oppressed, not the oppressor. So there are lots of ways that you can share that message through social media. There's as I mentioned earlier, the podcast series as well. So if people are interested, it is available on things like Spotify, Google Podcast, most platforms. You can listen to the 6 podcast series called Untold Killing. And that will really kind of help people understand a lot more about what happened.
Where can they access the podcast? Is it on main platforms? Or?
Yes, so Spotify, Google Podcast, all of the main podcast platforms. Obviously on Remembering Srebrenica's website, there are lots of resources, as you were saying. We have a great team at Remembering Srebrenica working in, obviously, media and comms, but in education and faith work.
It is a fantastic website. I mean, I went on there and I just had so much information. And actually, for me, it was important to have a reliable source as well, because I found on some of the social media and the, videos that I found online, the timeline was a little bit skewed. So actually, it's good to know that there is a reliable resource out there for us to be able to find out more information.
And I mean, and they've worked with some amazing academics as well. So Professor Kenneth Morrison over at De Montfort University, Professor Eric Gordy at University College London, Professor David Pettigrew as well, actually from America, actively involved in making sure that the historical context is accurate and that we're using the right language. I think that's really important. But, people in schools, in the police service, in faith communities, there are resources for everybody. Actually, Leicestershire Police this year and last year as well have run events for us. So I was up there last week. They were training their neighbourhood officers, so teaching them about what happened in Srebrenica and how they can obviously build more cohesive communities. We had lighting of the Srebrenica candle in the memorial gardens there. And I mean, we've been so blessed to have the support we've had from Leicestershire Police. They have been absolutely amazing. Working with the hate crime scrutiny panel. So I sit on the hate crime scrutiny panel, working with Isla Dixon, hate crime officer.
So I will be joining that panel soon.
Excellent. Oh, this is going to be wonderful.
So we will be working together and we'll be seeing more of each other soon. So unfortunately, I can't make the next meeting, but I will be there in the future. So
that's great.
I look forward to working
with
you.
Absolutely. And they are really proactive. Isla Dixon, the hate crime officer, has been an absolutely amazing support, and she's going to be joining the East Midlands Regional Board for Remembering Srebrenica.
So I think we have a call. Just bear with me. Just from Samir in Dubai. Just put your headphones on, Kim. Hello, Samir. Hello, Samir. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, how are you?
Alhamdulillah, how are you?
Yeah, not bad, not bad. Look, I mean, Srebrenica, tragedy, but really the breakup of Yugoslavia was all a tragedy, all unnecessary. I still can't understand the point of it. Essentially, it just seems to me it was neighbors, family members, all butchering each other for no reason whatsoever. Not to condone what the Serbs had done, but let's be honest, the Serbs were fighting to keep a country together. And I don't think as Muslims, even at university, as active as I was, raised money, got involved. Overnight, we were brought up and brainwashed by what I would call as Muslim nationalists who dislike people that we never really met. We didn't know what made them tick. And we were all blinded. And I find it was a tragedy for both the, shall I call, Slavic Muslim community, as well as the Orthodox Slavs, because essentially they were the same people, same ethnicity, same language, same common heritage. They drink the same coffee, they eat the same food, they were neighbors, but for no reason whatsoever, they ended up butchering each other. And as I say, in face of Serb nationalism, the Muslim community decided that the best way to go was, rather than be inclusive and maybe try and keep Yugoslavia together, they decided that they wanted to instill their own Muslim nationalism. And it was the biggest disaster there ever was for European Muslim community.
Thank you, Samir. I will get Kim to reflect on that a little bit, but thank you for your call.
You're welcome.
I suppose in terms of responding to that, I think one of the key things here, as we said, Yugoslavia was a multi-ethnic, multi-faith society where everybody had lived well and cohesively together. But actually what happened with the independence of each of the components, each of the republics within former Yugoslavia, yes, there was ethno-nationalism, but actually what happened in Srebrenica wasn't about Bosnian Serbs wanting a multi-faith, multi-ethnic society. It was about Bosnian Serb supremacy and, you know, a cleansing of other communities. So although Muslim majority were those who were targeted, Croats also suffered too as part of that conflict. And it was very much about setting up what we now call Republika Srpska. So actually that's translated means Greater Serbia. And it was a Serb nationalist movement to do so, supported by Serbia as a country.
Which
so
is why I think
Milosevic.
we've avoided sort of the religious aspect anyway. We've said that Christians and Muslims, they were all living together in harmony, and I guess, and I have as well, because I understand that it wasn't just Muslims that suffered in this genocide. There were people from, like you said, it was a country that they were living in harmony, and then it ended up becoming divided.
Yeah, absolutely, by nationality. So although there is this common shared history, actually, if you go way back, then you start to see the differences. And actually what the Bosnian Serbs were saying is that the Bosnian Muslims, the term they used was Turks, so they were Ottoman, and they were saying we're basically repaying what had happened in history, so we're repaying the Turks for the conflicts that had happened previously. So there is a long, incredibly complex political history here.
Yeah. In reality here, it doesn't matter what religion you are. If it wasn't no reason. There were people, it doesn't matter who they were, that were essentially trying to get power. It's about power. So there's a reason, isn't there? There is a reason. It is power. And that division enables you to get power over the people. And that's what essentially it was about. And that's where it came from.
Yeah.
So I noticed that there was also a website called Srebrenica 360 that was off your website that enables you to have a bit of a museum online. So I would definitely recommend the audience to have a look on that. That was really interesting, open, and it's a bit more interactive, which I thought was really engaging. So
when I talked about the Potocari Cemetery earlier, where the UN base was originally set up, that's now the Potocari Cemetery, and the Srebrenica Memorial Centre are based in that building, and obviously the land nearby. And so the 360 tour actually allows you to go and walk round there and see Potocari Cemetery as if you are there.
So if we wanted to visit and go out there, how easy is it for us to go out there and visit like you did?
Obviously with COVID.
Aside from COVID.
There are still some issues in place. But actually it's very easy. I mean, there are flights that you can get. There was a direct flight, but that company's not running currently. But you can get flights where you stop over in Europe somewhere before heading out into Bosnia. You know, if you fly into Sarajevo, which is the capital, it's kind of like going from here to, say, up to Yorkshire if you're going to Srebrenica. So it's going up into more hilly, you know, beautiful countryside. But if you based yourself, and maybe did it as a multi-site trip, so you started off in Sarajevo, there are some places in Sarajevo, so the War Childhood Museum that you can visit as well. And that's fascinating because there are exhibits that people who were children during the Bosnian genocide have given to the museum, so you can see what childhood was like. Right. And of course, you know, it was 26 years ago, so still like within our lifetimes.
Yeah, of course.
So you can go, you know, start off places like that, go to Makali Market, and you'll actually see what they call the Sarajevo Rose. And it sounds beautiful, and it is and it isn't, because actually they're the markings of where shrapnel had hit the ground. And instead of covering it all over, what they've done is they every year they paint them red, as a mark of respect. And so you can go around Makali Market and see those. And see, you know, the bridges. I mean, Bosnia is one of the most beautiful countries I've ever been to. They have rivers and bridges, beautiful bridges. So you can go and easily visit. Going up to the Memorial Centre in Srebrenica as well, you know, it is a functioning memorial museum. And they have curators and education team exhibits, but also you will hear survivor testimony there as well.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
That sounds amazing. It definitely would be something on my list, especially after speaking to you. Most definitely would be somewhere I would like to go and have a look and get a more real education. I think there is importance in going out and actually hearing accounts or seeing it for yourself. I think it puts things into a better context. Yeah. Once you've been out there, and it actually gives you more of a passion towards the cause as well. But thank you for speaking to us today, Kim.
That's okay.
It's been a pleasure. I've learned so much. I'm looking forward to meeting you again. It seems that we will be working in other capacities. One of the things I just wanted to say is if there's two stories that you can look into this week, local stories and global, I think it's important to look into the new Leicester Police and Crime Commissioner story by Rupert Matthews, who refused to work with the BLM movement but was actually spotted at the Leicester protest. But it's important to look into the story and the Haiti president assassination. I think they're two topics that are really important to look into at the moment. So thank you for tuning into my show. Inshallah, next week we'll be tackling another key topic in retrospect. And you're listening to HAJ Radio 87.9 FM.